For the Sake of My Children, a novel by Dr. A. Ahmed. This is an intriguing epic story which resonates with love, resilience, courage, and sacrifice. Copyrights. All rights are reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced, stored in a retrieval system, or transmitted in any form or by any means without the prior written permission of the author, except by a reviewer, who may quote brief paragraphs for a review to be printed in a public newspaper, general magazine, school journal, or university article. This novel narrates the life story of an Australian girl who fell in love with a Saudi man. Then she converted to Islam, married her Arab lover, and traveled with him to the Islamic world. This novel is a work of fiction, but the entire story is based on a true love affair between a former Christian girl and a Muslim immigrant. All names, characters, places, and events are either the product of the author's imagination or used literary. Therefore, any resemblance to actual people, living or dead, events, or locales is merely coincidental. Chapter 8. The Parser for the 3 times divorced Muslim wife. The detained Australian woman and the Sudanese couple were released from police custody after 24 hours. Their release came as a result of Mustafa's uncle's intervention. The uncle convinced his nephew to drop the charges against his ex-wife and the Sudanese couple. During the long hours of her detention, the Australian wife was mercilessly beaten by the huge Saudi female police interrogators until she confessed everything about her attempt to escape with her 4 children and return them without their Saudi father to her native Australian homeland. Once Ershad was released, Mustafa and his uncle met her outside the police station and offered her a free ticket home. The uncle told her that the marriage relationship between her and his nephew had ended because of the final 3rd divorce. He also said that, according to Sharia law, she could not live with Mustafa again. When she asked for custody of her children, the uncle reminded her that the law in Saudi Arabia and other Islamic countries gives the Muslim father custody of his children. Despite this, the triple-divorced Australian woman has refused to accept a plane ticket and is determined to fight for custody of her 4 children. She even threatened to sue and bring her Saudi ex-husband to a criminal court if he refused to give her children. Mustafa and his uncle ignored her threats and left. They both know that no secular court in the whole of Saudi Arabia can break Islamic law and award custody to the mother. However, the divorced Australian wife did not give up and tracked down her ex-Saudi husband to his former apartment, which she had fled from it with her children. At the apartment, Mustafa closed the door in her face and threatened to beat her if she kept knocking on his door. When the divorced Western wife ignored her ex-husband's warning, he assaulted her and started beating her as if he were beating a dangerous wild animal. Some African and Asian neighbors gathered around and begged the Saudi husband to stop the severe beatings to save his foreign wife's life. However, the angry Saudi man ignored them and continued to beat the Australian woman until she fell to the ground and passed out. Immediately, some foreign neighbors called the police because they were afraid that the angry Arab might continue to beat the white woman to death. Despite that, the Saudi man did not stop beating the body of his unconscious Australian ex-wife until the police arrived. That day, Mustafa was arrested for the attempted murder of his Australian ex-wife, while Ershad's unconscious body was taken to hospital. Miraculously, the Australian woman survived the brutal beating of her ex-Saudi husband. She was discharged from the hospital the next day. Once she left the hospital, she went to her good Sudanese friends and told them what her ex-husband had done to her. Sulwa invited her to stay in her apartment until her 4 children's case was settled in court. Shortly after her recovery, Ershad filed a complaint in the Sharia court and demanded custody of her 4 children. Her Sudanese friends advised her never to go to her ex-Saudi husband's apartment again. Meanwhile, Mustafa was released from custody on bail. Somehow, through a huge bribe, the uncle managed to convince the Dammam police to give up his nephew and ignore the serious charge of attempting to kill his Australian ex-wife. Corrupt Saudi police have dropped the attempted murder charge against the abusive ex-husband and closed the case. 2 weeks later, Irshad and Mustafa were invited to come and stand before the virtuous Maulana, Qadi of the Court of God, and his messenger in the Dammam Sharia court. In the Islamic court, no one is allowed to appoint a lawyer. The truth is that the Islamic court does not allow any lawyer to stand before its judge. What the Diwan of God and his messenger demand to issue its judgment, which is believed to be a divine judgment determined by God Almighty before the establishment of the universe, are the two conflicting parties and nothing else. After a long wait, an old man entered the courtroom dressed like one of those people who go to Mecca and Medina on a pilgrimage or about to perform particularly important religious rites. He is most likely in his late 70s. He supports himself with a long walking cane. Everyone in the court was told to stand, and no one was allowed to sit down until this old man took the judgment seat. He has no jury to consult with and no attorneys to challenge his verdict. He is the sole judge, and there is no other. When he makes a judgment, his judgment is forever binding. No one has the power to overturn his judgment. Even the king of Saudi Arabia cannot overturn his final judgment. He never attended law school, and for this reason, no one can call him a judge because he is above a secular court judge. They call him Maulana, which means our spiritual leader or master, the venerable Imam. This honorary title can only be conferred on a Sharia court judge, mosque imam, religious leader, or Islamic scholar. Everyone treats him as infallible, like the Prophet of God, Muhammad, who does not make mistakes. They believe that he can never be wrong in his final judgment, no matter how absurd and unfair it may seem to one of the two opponents. The elderly judge already knows that Sharia law does not allow a mother to have custody of the children, but for the sake of formality. He asked the Australian woman to tell the court why she wanted to keep the children and did not want their Saudi father to have custody of them. Irshad tried to prove to the virtuous Maulana that her ex-husband is an abusive man, but the same judge refuted all the evidence she presented. She used the female genital mutilation of her young daughter, Aisha, as a reason, but this reason was rejected on the grounds that it is from the Sunnah imposed by the infallible Prophet of God that Muslim girls must be circumcised. Then she referred to the second marriage of her Arab husband to another Muslim wife. She said when she was in Australia, the wife of the Imam of the Sydney Mosque told her that only if there was a reason such as infertility or illness, a Muslim husband could marry another woman besides his first wife. Judge Maulana gave her a lecture on the importance of completing the Sunnah of the Prophet by marrying more than one wife and not having more than 4 wives at the same time. He also told her that the wife of the Imam of the mosque in Australia taught her wrongly by telling her that it is not permissible for a husband to marry a second, third, or fourth Muslim woman unless there is a reason. For example, the elderly judge said that he has 4 wives at present and all 4 women have children and are in good health. Finally, the divorced white girl, Irshad, mentioned that her ex-husband, Mustafa, used to beat her a lot, and even kicked and slapped his children from time to time, for or without reason. Maulana responded by saying that Mustafa, as a husband and father, is allowed under the Quran and encouraged by the Prophet of God to beat his disobedient wife and rebellious children. To support his decision, he quoted from Surat Al-Nisa 4, verse 34. This noble verse permits the husband to beat his disobedient wife, the father his bad daughter, and the brother his sister who rebelled against his authority as a man. The honorable judge also referred to the hadith of the Prophet to reinforce his point. Narrated by Umar ibn al-Khattab on the authority of the Prophet Muhammad, may God bless him and grant him peace, who said that a man should not be asked why he beats his household. Mentioned in Sunan Ibn Majah Volume 3 Book 9 Hadith number 1986 and in the inclusion in Sunan Abu Dawud, Book 11 Hadith number 2142. To prove that he is a fair and impartial judge, Maulana asked the Saudi ex-husband to give him a reason he should not allow his Australian ex-wife to take his 4 children to Australia for visitation to her relatives. Mustafa said that his ex-wife, Irshad, was recently arrested by the Dammam police while planning to flee Saudi Arabia with his 4 children to her native country. As a Muslim father, Mustafa told the judge he did not want his Arab children to grow up in a secular country like Australia. He said in those infidel countries that a man and a woman live together in one bedroom without marriage and commit adultery freely and without fear of deterrence from parents or the police. And a homosexual man is allowed to marry another man and practice sodomy openly, and a woman can marry another woman, and both indulge in the practice of lesbianism. Alcohol is sold like groceries in stores. Porn videos are distributed among students in schools just like their textbooks, and drugs are sold to them on public streets. At the end of the day, the Sharia court ruled in favor of the Saudi man, and custody of the children depends on their father taking care of them forever. After the decision of the Sharia court, the Sudanese couple advised the divorced Australian woman to accept her kismet and bad share in life, return to her country, and start a new life with another man as a second Muslim husband. However, Irshad said she could never leave her 4 children in Saudi Arabia and return to her country Australia at any cost. In order to live with her 4 children, Irshad decided to compromise with her ex-Saudi husband, Mustafa, by asking him to take her back to his apartment for the sake of their young children. Her Sudanese friend, Sulwa, played a key role in trying to resolve the dispute between the divorced Australian wife and her Saudi ex-husband. After much meddling, Mustafa agreed to take Irshad back to live with him, but not as a wife. She is allowed to return to her former apartment and live as a mother to her children and an unpaid maid to her ex-husband. For the sake of her children, the divorced Australian wife has agreed to move back into the apartment of the abusive man and her assailant. Before she moved in with him, the Saudi man had warned her that if she tried to trick him and play another game by kidnapping his children and running away, he would either make her spend the rest of her life in a maximum security women's prison or send her to her grave her with an honor killing or bury her alive in the Sahara Desert. Mustafa then forced Irshad to place her right hand on the Holy Quran and promised her that she would never try that dirty game again. Yet, deep in her heart, the terribly abused Australian girl never gave up her desire to save her 4 children from their abusive biological father and his evil Arab Muslim community. For the time being, she decided to make concessions until there was a suitable opportunity for them to escape again. Then the divorced 3-times wife Irshad returned to her 4 children in the apartment of her ex-husband Mustafa and lives in a separate room. The ex-husband knows that Islamic law prevents him from sleeping with her because she is no longer his legitimate Muslim wife because he divorced her 3 times. Therefore, he never tries to disturb her peace or harass her sexually. Irshad was greatly relieved when she understood that her ex-husband is an honest believer when it comes to the laws of his religion. For a few days, the Australian girl lived peacefully among her 4 children. However, this peaceful atmosphere turned to hell when the uncle learned that his nephew had repossessed his thrice-divorced foreign wife. The uncle is a deeply religious man and follows the laws of his Islamic religion strictly. He interpreted the return of the thrice-divorced wife to her previous home as his nephew cohabiting illegally with a woman who is no longer his legal wife and committing adultery with her. Therefore, as soon as he found out about the forbidden matter, he stormed into the apartment in a state of extreme anger and forced Mustafa to expel Irshad immediately. According to the uncle, if his nephew wants to get his ex-wife back, he has to convince her to marry a muhalal man, which means that he is another Muslim man who can legitimize the pussy of a woman who has been divorced 3 times. The uncle supported his objection by quoting from the Quranic verse, which means, "And if the husband divorces his wife for the 3rd time, then after this divorce, his ex-wife does not remain his lawful wife unless she marries another husband. The second husband agrees to divorce her so that she can return to her first husband. In this case, there is no harm if they, the first couple, get remarried," quoted by Syed Abu-al-Ala al-Maududi, The Meaning of the Quran, Volume 1, page 165, referring to Surah Al-Baqarah 2, verse 230. The Saudi ex-husband followed his uncle's advice and somehow convinced his Australian ex-wife of God's law on the 3-times divorced wife. The divorced white girl reluctantly agrees to marry a stranger. Then Mustafa brought in a man who agreed to be the parser of the pussy of the ex-wife. In her entire life, Irshad had never seen such an ugly man as this Muhalil. He is short in stature and has a large head like the rest of his body. His little eyes could barely be seen. He is bald and most likely in his late 50s. He is originally from Somalia. Mustafa made the deal with him and paid him a certain amount of money. Then he and Irshad's marriage took place on the same day he came to their apartment. The marriage was conducted by the imam of a nearby mosque with 2 Muslim male witnesses who witnessed and signed with the mazoon and the husband the marriage contract. As a Muslim woman, Irshad was not allowed to sign her second marriage contract with the muhalil of her pussy. According to the secret deal, the Somali man can sleep in the apartment one day, and the next day he must divorce the Australian girl, receive the rest of his money, leave, and never show his ugly face again to Mustafa or Irshad. That day, the muhalil slept alone in a separate room. His halal Muslim wife, Irshad, spoke to him kindly and served him dinner. However, the next day, the cunning Somali husband refused to divorce his beautiful white Australian wife on the pretext that she had become his Muslim wife according to the Holy Quran and the blessed Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad. Mustafa threatened to kill him. The man filed a legal complaint against him. Therefore, the matter came to the ears of the judge of the Sharia court. His Eminence Maulana al-Mubarak said that even if the Somali husband agrees to divorce his Australian wife, Irshad, she still cannot return to her Saudi ex-husband Mustafa. The judge cited a hadith of the Prophet Muhammad, in which he said that the second husband must taste Irshad's honey, and she must also taste his honey, which means that they must have sexual intercourse even once before the divorce. The judge cited a similar incident that occurred during the time of the Prophet Muhammad. Aisha said that Rifai's wife came to the Prophet Muhammad and said to him, Abd al-Rahman divorced me while I was with him as a piece of his garment, meaning he divorced her without having sexual intercourse with her. Is it permissible for me to return to my ex-husband Rifa? The Prophet said to her, You cannot return to your ex-husband until you taste his sweetness, and he tastes yours, honey, that is, you must have sex with your ex-husband, Abd al-Rahman, Sahih al-Bukhari. The famous Muslim commentator al-Suyuti mentioned in his book Asbab al-Nuzul, page 46, that a woman came to the Prophet Muhammad and said to him, Abd al-Rahman, the muhalil whom she married after her divorce 3 times. He divorced me without having any sexual relations with me. Can I go back to my ex-husband? The Prophet Muhammad said to her, No, this is not permissible until Abd al-Rahman has sex with you first, and then you return to Rifa. When the Somali muhalil is pressured by Mustafa and the uncle, he agrees to divorce Irshad on one condition: she has to sleep with him at least once. He insisted on tasting her honey, and she made his own, by inserting his cock into her pussy and fucking her, and his semen flew into her womb for once. The ex-husband and his uncle agreed to his immoral and humiliating condition for the Australian ex-wife because they knew it was required by Islamic law. However, the white wife Irshad adamantly refused to allow such a man whom she did not recognize as her husband to have sex with her even for a second. When the Australian girl refused to fulfill God and his prophet's condition, Mustafa and his uncle told her to pack her clothes and leave the apartment immediately. Irshad knew and understood that if she left, she could not dream of seeing her 4 children again, because in Islam there is no such thing as a visitation right for a divorced mother to her children who live with their father. So, because of her circumstances and her intense love for her 4 children, Irshad reluctantly agreed to fulfill the Sharia condition. Never has an Australian woman felt more humiliated and abused throughout her life than when the ugly Somali man brutally raped her in her bedroom with full knowledge of her Saudi ex-husband. Meanwhile, Mustafa sits outside his bedroom as if he were the bodyguard of his ex-wife's rapist or the pimp who brought a man to fuck his wife in his bed. The body of the so-called thrice-divorced wife's pussy parser emits a stench like the decomposing corpse of a dead animal. While raping her, his mouth produces a foul smell of snuff and bad breath. Looks like he hasn't brushed his yellow teeth or taken a shower in his life. He jumped over her body like an animal jumping over the body of a resisting female animal or a dog fucking his doggy in the street and in broad daylight. Irshad felt like a prostitute being raped by a homeless hustler who had come from the streets. Once he attacked her body, she began to fight back and push him away. He is such a strong man as the terrorist that she could not expel him from her body. She regretted that she had agreed to be locked in a room by a big padlock from the outside with such a beast man. She did everything she could to stop him from raping her. She scratched his face with her fingernails. She hit his body with her fists repeatedly. She bit his cheeks and shoulders with her sharp teeth. During her rape, she was screaming as loudly as possible and calling the name of her ex-Saudi husband Mustafa over and over again, but no one came to save her from her pussy legalizer. Before his big erect cock emptied the semen into her pussy and then into her uterus, the Australian girl lost consciousness and became like a lifeless corpse. Nevertheless, the muhalo continued having sex with the dead woman because Islam permits a farewell nikah or sexual intercourse for a husband with his deceased wife before shrouding her corpse and burying her in a grave. When she managed to regain consciousness and open her eyes again, the Australian girl found herself in the hospital. Her Saudi ex-husband is standing like a devil in front of her with a terribly angry face. He looks at her accusingly, as if she had deceived him, cheated on him, slept with another man, and allowed him to fuck her with his cock in her pussy, and she did that in his apartment, in his room, and on his bed, which he bought with his own money. Instead of putting the blame on his prophet who authorized the husband to bring a man to fuck his wife in his bed to legalize her pussy for him, the Arab husband Mustafa put the blame on his Muslim wife Irshad, whom he divorced thrice.